Welcome to Convo Heals, the transformative mental health podcast.
We're three remarkable women from diverse backgrounds.
Join forces to harness the incredible healing power of conversation.
Each season, we embark on a journey
of exploration, empathy, and shared experiences
to illuminate the profound impact that thoughtful dialogue can have on our lives.
Welcome back to Convo Heals. Season 1 is Parenting Whole. We're here with episode 2. We're talking about parenting whole, under stress, and in the context of trauma. I'm Dr. Erika Bachnick.
Dr. Brandi.
Dr. Raveau.
So let's get into it. Let's do a little overview for the folks out there. And just like episode 1, if you were listening, we're going to give you a summary of the episode. We're going to give you a segment on the science, a segment on the wisdom, and a segment on the practice. You can listen to just one segment while you're washing the dishes, driving the kids to school, or you'll listen to all of them and you'll get the whole conversation. But we really thank you for being here and being a part of the conversation. It's the convo that heals. All right, so stress and trauma.
Woo!
Where do y'all want to begin?
A nap. That's where I want to begin.
But isn't it so crazy? I mean, we've been studying the effects of stress and trauma as researchers for, well, me. I feel like I'm the senior person here. So I've been doing this for decades. And it feels like lately everyone is talking about stress and trauma. Yeah. Right?
But it's been our love affairs for a long time, hasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a singular
academics and researchers.
It does feel like a singular dimension to the conversation too. And I hope you get into the science of this. I mean, stress and trauma is bad. It's all bad. All bad.
That's what the popular conversation is saying.
Right?
Yep. Yep. That's so true.
But it comes with, I think, the stages of grief. Feeling angry. It's one of the stages of it, right?
Yes.
I think what a lot of people are going through as they're getting their hands on some level of information, learning some things that are science-backed or not. But I think that's what it brings up in a lot of them.
Very true.
I think that most parents today feel like parenting itself is framed by being under a lot of stress.
Yes.
It feels like that experience is very much how parents define parenting. And I really wonder, sometimes it's hard to think outside of the conversation you're a part of, right? So I really do wonder if it has to be that way, if that is the context we're all living in. We've talked amongst ourselves that we're part of cultural communities where there's a really kind of a push-pull, a tension with talking about trauma that our people, for different reasons and in different ways, really value pushing ahead, not necessarily stewing in the past and the trauma, but really thinking of ourselves as strong, right? And that has the, strengths and its challenges.
Yeah. You stated a question, does it have to be that way? And I feel like it doesn't only have to be that way. Like, because I've said this before, confession. Like somebody's talking about their kids or they ask about my kids and I'll say, even you asking me is making me tired. Sometimes that's how that feels, but that's not only how that feels. So I don't think it's only that. I mean, sometimes parenting is stressful and sometimes it is hard, but that's not the only narrative.
But I do think it is one of the most important jobs we will ever do.
Absolutely.
And so people feel the weight of it as they should.
Because it's such a significant role. Yeah.
And I think, clinically, when someone tells us they're anxious, we have them reflect on, well, is the thing important? You are worrying about it. You're stressed about it because it's important. It would be weird if you didn't feel stressed. I think it's all about how we manage the stress, what we do with it, and what our relationship with the stress means for us, right? But I think for a lot of parents, they feel like, I must be doing something wrong, right? Or I wouldn't feel this way. And we're just doing life.
I also think you're going to constantly feel stressed if you are running in the dark. If you don't really have in front of you a clear set of values, aspirations, a way of thinking about what parenting is, what whole children look like for you at the end of the day, if you're not holding that in mind, if you're just literally trying to do everything, hoping something sticks, hoping something matters, that is bound to lead to burnout.
I think for many generations ago, people were constantly around babies and young children.
That's right, too.
And they were normal child development, they were getting exposed to it. And they had a lot of support from the grandparents and the older sisters. And this is one of the few newer generations where that's not the norm. And so we are heavily relying on social media and the books, but there is nothing like that hands-on experience. And so, especially for first-time parents, there's a lot of anxiety and stress around not wanting to traumatize the child.
I'm grateful that you acknowledged the way in which our cultures are changing, because that kind of normative daily exposure, like what you're describing, it normalizes that kind of stress-inducing energy. It's like, this is what it means to be community. This is what it means to be family. Kids running around and screaming and laughing and running through the house. That's not, oh, be quiet, you're being too... That's just what family sounds like.
Yes.
And we don't have as much of that.
And we're losing what are our best resources for dealing with stress, our relationships.
Right.
Unending love, unconditional love, friendship, support. We live in such isolated ways. But I really feel like we're segueing hard. We're headed hard into the science on this. Because something I think we're dancing around here, you guys, is what is stress?
Right.
What is trauma? So, I got to geek out on this. I got to talk about it from the scientific perspective on this, which is not the only perspective. But what's interesting about these words, stress and trauma, is that there's been, in kind of the Western psychological sciences, a pretty fraught conversation over the last 100 years since the Industrial Revolution. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the main diagnosis, mental health problem diagnosis associated with trauma, is relatively new. You all might remember that we used to say women were hysterical instead of stressed, traumatized, depressed, a whole range of things. And then after the Industrial Revolution, lo and behold, men who were coming into accidents with machinery were demonstrating hysterical-like symptoms. And so now this must be a thing. And we've started defining trauma ever since then. But ever since then, there's been hot debate among the leaders in our field about whether or not there should be a category of things that are universally stressful and traumatic. Or if this should be something that is defined by the person. So we could really talk at length about that. But what that has then really motivated a lot of us to do who are conducting the research on trauma and stress is to say, okay, functionally, what do we mean? So here's what it is. Stress is not good or bad. It's neutral. It's a force. It's something that promotes potential for change. Where stress becomes bad, so to speak, is when you aren't able to adapt in the face of it. But the stressor itself can be a positive thing. For example, moving to a new home, or making a new friend, or getting married. Those kinds of experiences, in fact, can even be traumatic. Because what trauma is a kind of stressful experience that creates an adaptation through which you actually make a change. You become different in some way. Now, we think about the word trauma as mostly when something terrible happens. So we don't want to think about it as changing who we are or defining us. And so we can get into that. But we would do well to understand trauma as a kind of process of learning. Because what the brain starts to do after trauma is say, okay, we didn't see that coming. So now a thing happened. Now we know something. And we've got to pay attention and look for it. And when that becomes problematic, it can create what's called hypervigilance, which means you're always on guard and you're not able to focus or pay attention to anything else. But Dr. Brandi, as you were alluding to, sometimes it makes you wise. Sometimes it makes you love harder. Sometimes it gives you a new set of skills. There's a whole body of research called post-traumatic growth.
My fave.
How do we adapt? How do we change for the better? So something I really want to get into today in the science, if you all indulge me, this is one of my little soapboxes. Okay, so everybody out there, you've heard the term, I know you have, you've heard the term fight or flight. Dr. Raveau, would you give them a little definition if they haven't heard what this means?
Yes. Fight or flight is when our body goes to this state of survival because on some level it has perceived some level of threat. Sometimes it's very conscious, sometimes it's subconscious. Sometimes the threat is there, sometimes it's our faulty neuroception based on our brain wiring or past experiences. And from the moment that the nervous system and the brain has perceived the threat, it starts getting the blood flowing to our skeletal muscles away from the major organs. And we get ready to either run away, fight, or freeze. And we know that it is necessary for survival and that it can be really damaging if it's chronic because the environment is chronically not safe, or even the perception of the environment is that I am not safe.
So get ready, because I'm going to break all of that apart. I know that that's what we've been told for a long time. And Dr. Raveau was just summarizing and quoting a lot of what we understand from the neuroscience, the scans we're doing on people's brains. But here's the thing. We're learning every day about the human body, about the brain. The methodology that we use to study the brain-body connection is very, very new, and it's mostly from animal studies. So we don't really know functionally if shocking a rat and seeing its reaction is the same thing as what happens for, let's say, me when I get the jitters up on stage in front of a room full of people. Is that the same? Is my brain and body doing the same thing? One of the things that always bothered me about fight or flight is the very idea that as human beings we would have some universal pattern of response. This didn't sit right with me because stress and trauma is so multifaceted. It's so encoded by our families, our communities, what we've been taught to fear, to wonder about. The other thing that bothers me about it, that made me want to start reading more about it, is the very idea, it's based on this idea that kind of like early humans were living in kind of fight or flight mode, that they had to be constantly physically protecting themselves because the conditions were harsh. But you guys know I'm a science geek. And what anthropologists seem to be uncovering about early humans is that they weren't living in fear all the time. We, modern humans, we live in fear much more. Early humans were wandering a lot. They were taking a lot of risks. They were affiliating with new groups they would meet up with, and then they would move on. Actually, it sounds like they were experiencing a lot of joy. So it started to make me just wonder, do we really base all of our decisions in life on whether or not we're afraid? It's not possible, because we fall in love, we get our hearts broken, we fall in love again, so it can't be that we learn best through fear, right? So all these things started to, sort of come into my head, and I thought, I want to really learn more about where fight or flight comes from. Why do we say this? Okay, so there's this guy, William Cannon, I think in the 1950s. I think it's 1950s. And listen, you guys, he was not a psychologist. he was an animal researcher, and he was interested in gastrointestinal processes. And so he had some dogs, and he noticed that after they got stressed out, their eating patterns changed. And he was curious about that. And he hypothesized that the reason was that risk creates an adrenaline rush, that adrenaline is connected to your digestive processes. And he coined the term from this as part of his hypothesis, fight or flight, that the adrenaline makes your behavior become aggressive or self-protective. He did not prove his hypothesis, first of all. So this is a language we use about something that wasn't even, it was disproven, and it was not about human behavior in the first place. Okay, now here's the other thing we're learning happens in the brain. And this is the part that I think is really important. What is happening in the human body all the time is an effort towards creating balance. Your brain is working for you. And I think this is important too, because I think the fight or flight model makes us think that we are wrestling with our brain, that if we're under too much stress, our brain's going to work against us. And that's not what's happening. Your brain is always trying to adapt. So you encounter stress, and the first thing that happens is a hormone, CRH, is secreted from the brain. CRH then sends a message down to the kidneys to secrete cortisol. Cortisol is what we call the stress hormone, but what cortisol mostly does is regulate digestion and metabolism. And the reason that pathway has to happen is because when we get a feeling, that spidey sense, that intuition, it tells our body to get ready, as you were saying. It's like, get ready, something's happening, we have to adapt. The cortisol then sends a message back to the CRH and says, you can stop secreting now. Balance, stability, they talk. Okay, you've sent me to do my job. I'm good. You can calm down. Another way we see this feedback loop happen is that cortisol creates a spike in blood sugar, and that makes your mouth dry. Why? So that you'll drink water and dilute the blood sugar. So we're constantly creating these feedback loops. And behaviorally, we're trying to do that too. Something happens, and we create some sort of a behavioral reaction that we believe will steady ourselves. Now, I think the reason that fight or flight feels so real to us is not because the brain is forcing us to do it, but because we have learned over time in this kind of modern world that those are the choices available to us. You either run or you fight. We don't teach each other anymore how to relate and wander and seek comfort and problem solve together. But those are also stability promoting behaviors that we could be seeking if we really understood what was happening in our bodies and our brains.
And we weren't, there's something so, first of all, you're my favorite geek.
Thank you. Thank you for that soapbox moment, you guys.
Hey.
Yes, thanks for saying that.
You're just my favorite geek, and fashionable. But I think something you're saying is unique, like the irony of it all is to then, like, essentially you're just saying, and to not feel threatened by it. Like, and then to not feel threatened by the fact that my body is trying to take care of me. Like, I just think there's an irony in the simplicity of that. Like, we're talking about stress, and we're stressed about the stress. Yes. We're talking about trauma, and we create ideologies that traumatize us about the trauma. And it's just such an interesting thing, because when you describe it in the way that you did, there's something about it that makes me actually kind of settle into a bit of gratitude around just my personhood and my body, and not to feel so threatened by an internal experience that I might be having when I'm in a situation or when I'm having an experience.
Now, the other thing I will say that I want to really highlight here is that you're talking about it too from kind of a personal vantage point. But what I want to also highlight you're calling attention to is that when we're under stress, and we are sort of seeking that stability, and we're in an environment maybe where that's not available to us, our reaction might be to work against ourselves.
Yes.
But where there's possibility in the environment, this is important, right? Because what I also don't want to do is to say we traumatize one another, we oppress one another. And we focus on the part of that that's the actual force. But what I think is maybe even the bigger impact on mental health is not the primary force itself, but the secondary absence of room to adapt, to resolve, to find meaning, to seek comfort. We don't have the space or the time or that possibility.
Or the belief system. I think with the way in which you're kind of assisting and re-educating us around how we make sense of this is really vital, because you've talked quite a bit about aspirational values and values in the home and values around parenting, just our belief system about that possibility. And that's why your reference to, post-traumatic growth, I think, is really useful in this conversation, because a lot of us don't really talk about it in that way.
It's a
like
mindset
the value
issue. It's a mindset issue. If your mindset of your family or your culture is that some things are good and some things are bad, and that it is not, there's good feelings and there's bad feelings, right? And there's a way to react when you're feeling a certain way, and there's not, when it's so black and white, then you're going to be so limited. But I think the moment we change our mindset, and so much of it is in the psychoeducation piece for families, where it's okay if we are feeling mad or stressed or anxious, that opens up the door to a whole nother way of being. But people don't have that. And it's a very foreign concept to them. And I think, again, for me, it goes back to this idea of grief, because when you teach a parent that it is okay that you are feeling stressed or that you are anxious or you're feeling mad and overwhelmed and overstimulated and stressed, that is not the problem. To trust your body. Your body's trying to do its work. Tune into it. And how can we, as a community, tune into each other versus let's just minimize and suppress and shut down. I think it's like, wow, like of all the years I've lived without this, and being aware of the work it will take to trust again.
Dr. Brandi, we've talked about we've made reference to post-traumatic growth a couple of times. Do you want to summarize that scientific concept a little bit for the folks?
Yeah, and just in a nutshell, in a really general fashion, post-traumatic growth is this kind of posture or this position of understanding that recognizes that there's a lot of value that comes from, experiencing, enduring, and navigating through what we deem to be traumatic life experiences or stress-inducing experiences, whether we're talking whatever they call small t, big T, complex, there's all these terms around trauma, and how as a result of that, you kind of alluded to it earlier, you can come out of it with a really restorative perception or experience, not just of yourself, but your world. And the domains that post-traumatic growth focuses on is spirituality, relationship. I think, what are some of the other ones? There's 2 others. There's 4.
Optimism.
Well, and I don't know how much this is written about, to be quite frank, but I also think identity. Like identity and self-efficacy, like who you are and what you're capable of. How often have you anticipated an experience or heard of a lived experience and said, I don't know if I could ever handle that. I could never go through that. And then you do. And then you come out of it and you're like, I'm a bad mamma jamma. Bad word. Like, I had no idea I was capable of that.
And I think this sense of groundedness within, with ourselves and with our higher power is really something that no one can really give to you, but that you earn through walking through the fire of those hard moments. And parents are so anxious to try to get rid of all of those challenging things for their kids. But they forget that sense of, I know myself and I trust myself and I believe in myself. It's like that humility, right? And that I am not an entity on my own. Like, I'm bigger than just me comes through those experiences where you kind of are brought to your knees, right?
I know.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't steal that from our children.
And I think, too, a really powerful framing for me is this idea that I'm not broken by what happens to me. I regenerate. I grow again. And would I have wanted that growth to happen a different way? Yeah.
Sure. That'd be nice.
Yeah. But this is how life goes. This is another thing. We sometimes talk about stress and trauma as aberrant human experiences, exceptional, unusual, that we have to treat. But actually, the most universal human experience there is, besides, I think, falling in love, is trauma. It's extremely mundane, actually.
Now, why is it that it's such a universal thing for people who've been traumatized to feel broken? They will say consistently, I feel either, like flawed, broken, used, trash. People will use these words to describe their relationship with the self because of the traumatic thing they experienced.
When the real truth is simply, I'm uncomfortable. That's it. This is new. This is unsettling, maybe.
Well, I think the other thing to name, though, and this is also a research-based idea, but also we know it from the lived experience, is the reason that happens is because we live within broken systems. So the reason people feel broken by trauma is because access to healing. So, right, what we're saying is we need room to become even more fully who we are. And that is only afforded to people who have the most power and privilege and who write the rules. And we're all just trying to access some sliver of that. So the people who don't recover, right, we have to shift how we think about healing. It's a group project. It's a collective process. Because if we don't give each other real space, if we can't create more belongingness in the world, then we can't expect people to really heal.
I can really appreciate that you're naming that, because that's a big inhibitor to that which is actually quite natural. Like this idea of kind of normalizing a trauma-based or a stress-based experience, but being able to move through, navigate, collectively heal is awarded to some and not others in different ways.
And I think tuning into the broken systems makes a lot of people feel powerless and helpless and hopeless. So they internalize and say, I am broken. And it's a way of coping.
You're not broken.
All right.
Like,
So
yes.
I hope a few therapists heard us here rip apart fight or flight, and that we're going to talk in more expansive ways with our clients and patients and communities about affording one another space for adaptation. Let's move on next to the wisdom, the cultural wisdoms about facing stress and trauma and parenting children who can do the same.
There's a story that comes to my mind. I think narrative is really powerful, and stories really bring to life like the value of some of the science. And as you were talking about this, I don't know where I would qualify this as a trauma, but I recently induced a trauma upon my children where I stripped away the video games. I mentioned this to Erika, where we had a conversation about how the way in which, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this for everybody, but I'm telling you how this showed up in my family, where we talked about how the culture in our home wasn't vibing right with the video games. I was like, I don't think we're a family that really plays video games that much. I just don't think that matches what we're trying to do here. So long story short, we stripped away the video games. My children were really just heartbroken about this.
Yeah, struggling.
It felt like a major punishment.
A major change.
A major
Something
change.
to adapt to.
Yeah, something to adapt to. And they felt a little blindsided by this, like, what? And so I had to really talk with them about how they were going to internalize what was happening. I was like, you're not being punished. I know it feels that way, but you're not being punished. You've done nothing wrong. I've made an observation about the energy in our home, the relationship that's going on between you and your brother. And I apologize, actually, because I put way too much responsibility on you to do something in the way they were navigating these games. And then I said, I think that what we might want to do is community, belonging, is figure out how to reconnect to each other differently. So like, let's get paper, and we got all the crafts, and we wrote out all these hobbies. Like, what are some things you're really interested in, or some things you really want to try? I'm like, me and Daddy are going to invest in this. We're going to invest in this. This is an opportunity for our family. And fast forward, we had a whole conversation. You're not being punished. And also, you're going to ask me every day when you're getting the video games back. You're not. Like, we just don't do this. And so fast forward later, after a few days of side eyes and them cursing me on my head, my oldest son comes to me crying. He says, "Can I talk to you?" And I say, I'm pausing for suspense. And I say, "What's up, baby?" He says, and he starts to cry, and he says, "I don't know why I ever doubted you." And he goes, "You know, I really miss the video games, but," this is about 2 weeks later, actually. He goes, "But I'm getting so much better at my music. Like, my career is going to be amazing." And he's like, "I'm getting so much better." And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this isn't what we deem to be trauma, but you were describing, Hasti, how the adaptation as a result of that tension, that physiological tension or that psychological tension brings so much value. And I felt like if I didn't have tolerance, because I really felt bad, if I didn't have tolerance for all the crying and all the tears and the mean stares and, their misbehavior, how, like, all the times before, I kind of would have folded or whatever. And I think that is just a microcosm of the cultural wisdom around what is the value in this home? How are we going to curate that? What kind of decisions do I need to make? And I guess I'm just curious to know, how is this, based upon all the knowledge you just shared with us and the science, how is that translating, and what messages are you getting, or do you bring into your home from your parents, your grandparents, your community around how you create health, wellness, connection in the home?
Well, I'm reflecting a bit on the beginning of my own parenting journey, which I think is in many ways not typical. I feel like in many ways I entered motherhood through trauma. As you guys know, I conceived my first child, I think a month after my brother died of suicide. And the pregnancy, I had PTSD, and I feel like even the way he was born, it was so traumatizing.
I remember. It's taking me back too. I was so worried. I was so worried about you.
Yeah, and it's like, it's not what you think, right? You're not thinking for yourself, this is how I'm going to go into motherhood.
Yeah.
And I remember when
I don't want to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I also want to ask you.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about trauma and the need to adapt and how that's such a human instinct to be adapting, it almost felt to me at the time like you were like, "I'm adapting." There was this kind of intense energy, right? Was I reading that?
Like, were you aware of that at that time?
Yeah, I remember feeling like my family's healing around this loss is riding on this.
Yes, like we're gonna, yes.
And
yes,
so
yes.
I am, like, it's all on me. And this baby is depending on me. And it's just like, yeah, like I have to just do it, And my mom said something to me that really stayed with me when she found out that I was pregnant. She said, "You have to raise this child," and she said it in Farsi, around cotton balls. both sides of the family really struggle with mental health issues. You have to make this child's environment so protective that, yeah, like she used this analogy, right?
So I can feel the pressure.
Yes.
I can feel it
Yes.
in my body.
Or he's going to, because, right, this is a woman who has just lost her only son to suicide. Before she knows it, her only daughter is now pregnant with a boy. And so that trauma is within the family. And I, unfortunately, parented that way for several years until I decided to leave my marriage. And what it really, really, really taught me was where I brought on a trauma for my family, right? Thinking about separating and moving and having them be in two different homes. It taught me that children are so resilient and that they need just the conversation. And it's ongoing. It's not a one-time thing. But you have to be willing with the discomfort of whatever they say to you and not feel this need to pacify quickly, right? But up until that point, because of that traumatic event, that is how I think I was parenting. Reactive, pacifying of the children.
The stories that we're sharing are very different in a lot of ways, but the thing that sticks out as singularly unifying is exactly what we're doing, how the convo really can heal. Because what you're describing is the value of the conversation, like giving language and narrative and kind of patience in the ushering of one lived experience to the next, to another one. It's not like preventing it from happening.
Yes.
And all the stress and anxiety and pressure that comes from preventing whatever this thing is from happening. It's about, how do I hold your hand? How do I usher you through? How do I help you think this through? How do I help you make sense of this and get comfortable with the discomfort of how that feels?
Yes.
You know, something it's making me think of as my own cultural wisdom, but also a tension, is that I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. I'm white, and I'm Jewish, and sometimes I don't experience full whiteness, and sometimes I am fully passing. So I've been thinking a lot about those tensions and how they show up in the everyday and how I'm parenting children and what I see around me. And it feels like there's this pull from American whiteness to not talk about hard things.
Yes.
Because if we don't talk about them, they don't exist. They only exist for other people. That is the privilege of whiteness, that you can escape the conversation. But that's toxic for me as a Jewish person to lean into, because we will always experience stress and we have to be ready for it. That's our conversation. And a wonderful gift of being Jewish is that we do not shy away from the gritty conversations. It's literally in everything. And over the years as a therapist, parents are always calling me and saying, how do I talk to my kids about death in the family, shooting at school, this terrible thing that happened on the news, et cetera, et cetera. And I always say, there's no answer to this. You have to start with, first of all, what you want your kids to know, what you think they need to know, but also, what is your family conversation about things? In my family, part of being Jewish is that my kids hear very young about people harming each other, about really kind of gory things, actually, really hard things to hear. We talk openly about all of this stuff. Yeah. And so it makes all the conversations about stress and trauma, even the small things in life and the big things, so normative that they are not frightened by information itself. Sometimes parents are afraid, and I think this is the whiteness, are afraid, am I traumatizing them by talking about it?
Well, it's the quintessential protect their innocence. Protect their innocence, as if it can be protected.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't, my favorite geek, you can't not have this conversation without talking about resilience. Can you speak to that?
Ooh,
a little
so
bit.
yes, Dr. Brandi asked me to do this because this has also been kind of a reckoning for me. I started in my career wanting to focus on resilience traits in children and in families, which means despite stress and trauma, what makes people heal and well. So we've talked about some of them. If you listen to the science segment, Dr. Brandi started us on a conversation about post-traumatic growth and the things that can help us cope. Spirituality, for example, is really important. But the idea of resilience itself is fraught because we keep putting this on the individual to be fine. And the more the world traumatizes us, the less capacity we have to just be fine. And this also goes back to this thing about resilience actually existing at the level of societies. Are we resilient societies, meaning do we offer space for people to be well and to heal? And isn't it so funny? I'm going to quote Dr. Rihanna Anderson again. I quoted her in the first episode. Here she is coming up again, episode 2. She said on a panel I sat on with her once at a research meeting, a rubber band is meant to stretch. That's its function. And just like we were talking about in the science, the brain is meant to create balance and adapt. But if you leave that rubber band in the sun, it loses its stretch. But the problem isn't the rubber band. It's the sun. It's the lack of shade. It's the lack of possibility, flexibility. So I think it's a challenging concept, but at the same time, I think for me, what it is to be Jewish is to accept stress and trauma as a constant, to not be frightened by it existing, to learn how to not be frightened by my children experiencing it, and instead really putting my energy into the things that do promote resilience, at least for us. And that's the thing, too, is that there's no universals. For us, I know that strong communities, strong faith, positive identity, and really linking arms with one another creates resilience, strength, perseverance, and it always has, generation after generation. And to be able to talk about that is the conversation my kids need. And it's its own kind of trauma if I try to not talk about it, not have the conversation. Because now I'm just leaving them alone in that struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the clear cultural kind of nuggets that was passed down to me that I kind of try to pass down to my children, like an heirloom, is the notion of what we've discussed as divine optimism. And this concept of like, I'm capable and I will be okay. Even in moments when I don't necessarily feel okay, that's okay, and quite normal, given the circumstance. So I'd love to hear more about like that. What are the things that kind of that you carried from your own background that you're kind of extending to your children?
Well, I think divine optimism is, again, this mindset decision around saying the is fine.
The is fine.
The is, and surrendering to the is. And not trying to do the tug of rope with it. And not wanting to rush through the moment. Right? And what is that formula for acceptance and commitment therapy, where they say life is pain, but suffering is optional, and suffering is when you resist life's pain. But I think when your whole life, people, when they see you activated, they say stop, right? I personally have really vivid memories of being impacted by stories that I was hearing or events that was happening to me, and I would get activated, and the adults would try to really quickly say, don't cry, don't feel how you're feeling. it's this urgency again around wrapping it up, right? And so for me, there is such beauty in the way we parent, where when our kids are not okay, saying, I don't have the right to tell you when you're done being mad or upset or anxious or whatever. Because I'm the parent, I get to decide that. How would we feel in adult relationships where we're venting to a friend or a sister or somebody and they say, I think time is up, right? Like, enough is enough.
I'm done with you being upset.
We have enough integrity for other adults to say, you know, when you're done feeling that way, I trust you to do that work for you, and I'm here for you. But we don't do that with children. We don't give them the same respect. And I think that is really critical around the stress and the hard moments and the traumatic things that are inevitable and that will happen to them.
One of my best friend, her name's Amy. I was telling her recently because she's really worried about one of her kids who's feeling anxious after a traumatic thing happened. The child's friend got sick at school in a really dramatic way, and it was really upsetting. So my friend Amy is feeling really worried, and she's like, will she be okay? Is she going to be anxious now about this forever? And I said to her, you know what's really kind of crazy? The way that I parent my children is very much like I think to myself, what would Amy do for me? When I'm upset about something, Amy does not judge what I'm upset about. She's very quick to be like, yeah, that's terrible. Shame on that person. Are you okay? What do you need? And when I say, I need an ugly cry and 3 cookies, she says, yes, that's the right answer. She trusts me.
Yes.
She's there for me.
Yes.
And she gives me the sense that we will be okay.
Yes.
And so it is safe to not be okay for a minute while I get there.
That's right.
Right? And then with her own kids, she's more on the hook, right? It's harder to trust our kids because in our minds we think we're supposed to fix this for them. That's our job.
I'm responsible.
Yeah.
I'm fully responsible.
Right.
Yeah.
But the more I can see my children as whole people, and I invoke the very real gift she gives me, and I trust that, the more I then say to my kids, I'm here with you for now.
Yes.
And this too shall pass.
Yes.
Because I know feelings come and go, and you will feel strong again. And for me, this taps into the Jewish wisdom, the cultural wisdom of it's not rare or special to persevere. It's human. That's how we see it, right? There's always a light in all of us. The Talmud, which is one of our sacred texts, says every person's life is a whole world. So this is also, I think, the wisdom I pass down to my children, that you are meant for greatness, just like everyone is meant for greatness of some kind. And so cry now and you get through it so you can make your impacts in the world. And I hold that in mind, I think.
I see that also in the Iranian culture, that when hard things happen, they'll say this too shall pass, and we have to be strong. And there's a lot of like, and you need to be strong for your father, and they need to be strong for you. Like, that's something that I remember when my brother passed, a lot of my relatives would say to me, this idea of like being, like they would say, you can't be strong for yourself right now, maybe, but maybe you can, it's easier to be strong for somebody else. And then eventually you'll get stronger for yourself. So again, it is about that kind of connection and the community piece. And again, that like for some communities, you don't have the option of not being okay. You have to persevere.
You have to. But you guys, hold on a second. When is that portrayal of strength healing?
Yeah.
And when is it rigidifying?
I don't think there is a singular answer to that. I think that the answer to that is the richness of the conversation we're having. Because what's so cool is you're speaking from a lens around your Iranian heritage. You're speaking from the lens of your Jewish heritage. And I am an American Black woman that, you know, there's this thread around a sense of communal responsibility for others, and that my strength is inherently connected to your strength, and my quote unquote resilience is connected to your resilience, and my joy is connected to your joy. And that's so beautiful. And I think I grew up where you can't show your experience. But that's what's so beautiful about cultural wisdom too, is I don't have to discredit my strength in order to elevate or magnify my humanness. I can actually hold both. It's all in how you hold it and how you narrate it and how you commune around it and how you talk about it. I don't think it's that it's good or bad, or you have it or you don't have it. I think it's kind of nuanced in that way. You know, like I'm strong for you and you're strong for me. And there are moments where my strength looks like tears. It's not the absence of tears. That is an element of my strength.
Yes.
I feel
That is a
so
feature
deeply.
of my strength. Yeah, being void of the range of human experience isn't what we mean by strength.
Yes.
So right now there's this cultural shift around the strong Black woman schema and the invincible Black woman syndrome, and I'm here to say I'm always going to be a strong Black woman.
Yeah.
I don't need to be quote unquote weak. I just need you to know and recognize the fullness of my humanity. That doesn't mean I'm not strong. And that's what that's a value in my home for my children.
I also think that like we need to have tolerance for diversity within communities in how we move through traumatic events and stress, especially when there is collective trauma, when one person is slowing down and feeling like lethargic or more prone to crying, that has its benefits. It helps others kind of slow down too and tap into the part of them that is holding on to that, right? Another person might be the one that is focused on the doing, right? And they're like, hey, come on, let's go do something, right? And they activate that energy. Another person's more focused on making sense, making meaning, connecting to higher power. Like, I think we have to have room for that and not say it has to be done a certain way. And I think what grief and trauma has taught me is that every season changes. We're always dying into parts of ourselves and then being reborn into other parts of ourselves. But we have to make room for that, not just for ourselves, but also our children.
So how, if we're shifting to the practice, because we always take the science and the wisdom, and we're talking about our stories as we grew up and how we kind of impart them on our kids, what's the bottom line here? Like, what does this look like on a Friday night with little Jimmy at the kitchen table? Like, what does it sound like? What does it look like? What are you doing?
So I want to give everyone maybe a little exercise you can do at home that I hope is helpful. What I encourage folks to do is to stop and pause, and some of this is about building the habit. Eventually it becomes more organic. You're experiencing something stressful. Figure out, first of all, what is my first awareness typically that I'm under stress. People often push past a lot of it, and so they don't even realize they're under stress until something happens, right? Maybe your home is in disarray, and that's your first kind of awareness. Oh, I've been kind of off this week. Or maybe you notice it in your body first. Or maybe when my husband and I are fighting, that is one of my first signals. Like, we fight when we're both under too much stress and we're kind of at each other, right? So whatever your first signal is, you step back and pause. And you can write this out even as you're building the habit. First, you say, I feel. And you have to learn how to tap in. What can I notice? For some people, it might be the physiological signals that you feel. Tired, edgy, my feet are asleep, whatever you notice first, you just observe. Or you might be able to tap into a feeling. I feel annoyed. I feel sad.
Overwhelmed.
You might be more in tune with your own thoughts, what I keep thinking is, or what my intention is, or what I'm stuck on is. Or you might notice your actions first. My behaviors are this, this, and this. I'm moving really quickly. I'm barking at my kids. Whatever you notice first, you just observe. So I feel. Then you want to say, I see. Because something that happens with trauma, again, it's a kind of learning, is that our brain learns to focus on risk factors associated with the trauma. Because your brain's like, just pay attention. So we stop paying attention to other things. So we get a signal, a feeling in that maybe feels a little bit like what we felt when we had a trauma. And our brain, we're moving too quickly. And our brain's like, oh, it's that thing, pay attention.
Yes.
So you slow it down and you say, what do I actually see happening? And you write, again, you just are observing. What are all the things I see? Things I'm noticing, things I'm not noticing. Then your next step, this is where you start to make meaning, is I wonder. What questions do I have? I wonder how other people here are feeling. I wonder what's missing. I wonder what's needed. See what generates as that last step. And then the reason you end with a question is because you go back to, I feel. I notice, I wonder, and you make it a cycle. You think about how what your brain is doing is trying to achieve balance.
I really appreciate that. I think culturally speaking, I would add an element here, a minor revision. I work primarily with African-American families, and detecting trauma can be very difficult, or stress. The normalization of certain things is so there. So even the I notice sometimes is my segue to the feeling. Like sometimes I can't even start there. Like, I don't know, numb, just no, I don't know. Apathy. So I notice can really be my entry into a cycle like that. I like that.
I really like what you're saying too, because when it's a circle, right, you can enter wherever is the right place for you. And maybe it's not even linear. Maybe you stay with, I notice, I'm wondering, I'm noticing again. Maybe you get yourself to stable ground in that way before you tap into I feel.
I like that.
But I think for a lot of people, I feel, and then shifting the focus internally is so distressing because they're so used to dissociating in all kinds of ways. I believe defensiveness is a form of disconnecting from what's happening inside of us.
Yes.
I get activated.
That's wise.
I can't hold it. So then I'm going to push it out, make you the container. And it's a strategy of disconnecting from what's happening inside because I can't be the container for this.
And I will be the first to say, I have done that to my children. We do that a lot in an effort to take care of ourselves. So noticing that dynamic is such a powerful, it doesn't have to be a shameful noticing. It's a powerful noticing. I don't have to be threatened by my imperfection because I know I've done that. I've made the difference between me telling my child, oh, it's okay, we'll clean it up, and like, oh my goodness, it's connected to my stress.
I think for me, the most important practice on managing stress and trauma is having abundance mindset and getting out of scarcity mindset.
Can you define those for everyone? I love what you're saying.
Scarcity mindset is this idea that we don't have enough, that, there's something bad around the corner. I got to kind of stay hyper vigilant, get ahead of it, 5 steps ahead, because something bad's going to happen. And then no one's going to come to the rescue and I'm going to be on my own and I don't want to feel on my own. And that we will not be able to get through what is going to happen. Abundance mindset says that there is enough. We can manage it. There are gifts in the pain. There are gifts in the struggle. If it's hard, it doesn't mean that it's bad. Maybe it's meant to be hard, right? And that's exactly where we're supposed to be right now. And there is, I think this idea that the gifts of life are in the hardness of life. If we are willing to receive it, if we want to open our heart to it, right? So for me, a lot of it is about shifting that mindset and saying life will unfold as it's meant to unfold. And I don't have to live looking over my shoulders constantly. And that I trust that I will pivot as needed. That if that worst thing ever in my mind was to happen, let's just say, I am resourceful and I am loved by my people and I am protected by my community, and collectively they'll help me pivot. I don't have to work so hard to stay ahead of it.
What if I don't believe that?
Well, I think that's problematic.
Well, this is what I'll say. Only because it feels...
Or maybe reflective of the situation.
It feels fair to say. Like,
Yeah.
what if I don't believe that? I can imagine somebody being like, that's nice that you feel that way. I don't feel that way. I'm of the belief that I don't have to fully. I can just declare it, though. It's mine to declare. I will be, so sometimes internally it feels like, yeah, I'm a badass. I can do that.
Yes.
And then sometimes it's like... but I'm going to claim it as mine. So maybe even if I don't believe it, maybe I can at least declare it or, aspire for it or something.
And maybe my ability to tap into it comes from my own privileges, right? From my education, being a clinical psychologist, from having most of my friends being mental health providers, from having financial stability as a businesswoman to care for my children and myself. So much of it is your environment, and it has such a big impact on what you are able to access.
I'll tell you what's so cool about this is I do believe it. And I think the reason I believe it is because I've done it over and over. And that's the magic of the trauma. When you've endured and you've navigated before, over and over and over, that's where my belief has come from. And that's why we get to gift that part of life to our kids. We don't want to, you said earlier, like we do not want to take that away from them.
I just want to give a little counterbalance here because I'm realizing in this conversation, we've talked a lot about capacity and possibility and growth. And I think it has to be said, it's also true when sort of really learning how to grapple with a stressful life in a stressful world, you're allowed to have limits. You're allowed to not always be growing and for not every moment to be a chance to be a creative problem solver. And I don't think we're not saying that, but I do want to add that. And actually, I'm laughing a little bit because this is something I've learned from my children because I have always been very type A where there's a will, there's a way. I'm going to white knuckle my way through it, whatever it takes. And my children are a little more chill. And sometimes this comes up for me with some tension because I'm like, we are hard workers. And sometimes my kids are like, I think I've studied enough for that test. I'm good. And I'm like, don't we just like kill ourselves studying? Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Just study and study and study or practice, practice, practice? What's happening here? When do you decide it's enough? And I realize it's triggering for me this kind of like... child of immigrants, grandchild of immigrants, like it's never enough. You have to always be pushing the limits.
Yes.
And so it even comes, what they've taught me, even in these like stressful moments when I'm like, I'm an octopus. I can grow another limb and make this work. I have this moment where I'm like, no, I'm actually hitting a wall here is what's happening. I'm just going to be late. This is not going to happen perfectly. I have to say no. And I think that's a really important message as women and as mothers. I wanna really make sure we're putting out there.
But we have to be very committed to reminding each other of that message. Like today, I was running late, right? And I had the sense of security and safety that you guys were not going to love me any less or be disappointed in me, right? But we have that within each other because of our commitment to sending certain messages to each other over and over and over and over. So much of it is on what is said and how we show up. And I think a lot of women and a lot of mothers struggle with that vulnerability. They hold back, right? They don't want to lean in and say what everybody knows, like you want to hear, you know, because of what that could open up the door to what else conversation, you know? And that's why you hear women say, I've been friends with these girls since, you know, grade school, and we don't talk about this and we don't talk about that, right? And so I think it requires a major commitment to hear the same things over and over that is essential for the post-traumatic growth to happen. Like, I can handle you being mad at me.
So I think the practice that we're really talking about, that we hope we impart, is about some new kind of concrete habits. Yeah. And also, again, it's about a stance. It's about a way that you can think about, be curious about the stress that you're under, and give yourself really the space to consider what adaptation looks like. So that's the practice. It's all about building new habits, thinking about a stance of wonder, curiosity about the stress that you're under. Unfortunately, stress is really becoming, it seems like, the framing universal experience for parents, but we really believe the conversation heals. And this really opens up doorways to new kinds of healing and ways that we can adapt. We thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today. Hopefully you leave here feeling a little stronger, a little more ready to face the world. We cannot wait to see you again for the next conversation.
The Convo doesn't stop here. For links to the resources and research mentioned in today's episode, head on over to the show notes at convoheals.com/2. That's convoheals.com/2.